The fuel stink hung over the Kuwait staging area for hours after the news came in. January 31st, 2003. An AC-130H Spectre gunship, callsign Spirit 03, took a surface-to-air missile south of Baghdad and broke apart over the desert. 14 crew, all killed. The aircraft belonged to the 16th Special Operations Squadron out of Hurlburt Field, Florida, and when the casualty notifications went out that morning, they hit a base that had already buried people before. Major Curtis Feistner commanded the aircraft. He'd flown Spectres for years. The crew included navigators, fire control officers, sensor operators, aerial gunners, every one of them trained for a mission profile that most combat aviators would call suicidal on paper. Fly slow, fly in circles, shoot straight down. So, why did 14 Americans die flying an airplane that cruised at 300 knots on a good day, couldn't outrun a Cessna in a dive, and orbited targets like a bird of prey the size of a school bus? Because the AC-130 worked. It worked so well that the people on the receiving end stopped calling it by its designation and started calling it the Angel of Death. That name didn't come from American marketing. It came from Iraqi soldiers. From journal entries recovered after the Gulf War, from interrogation transcripts at detention facilities, from letters home that never made it past coalition checkpoints. One translated diary entry, pulled from a dead Republican Guard officer near Basra in 1991, used a phrase that intelligence linguists rendered as the angel that circles and does not miss. The declassified summary notes the phrase appeared in multiple captured documents, attributed to different units, different sectors. These men had never coordinated their language. They arrived at the same image independently. That detail matters. If one soldier writes something dramatic, it's poetry. If dozens of them reach for the same metaphor across hundreds of miles of front line, it's a field report. If this kind of history means something to you, the kind that comes from captured notebooks and declassified after-action reports instead of Hollywood, hit subscribe and like this video. And if you flew on Spectres, or lost someone who did, put their name in the comments. Spirit 03 is more than a line in a database. The AC-130 had been killing people from the sky since Vietnam. By 2003, it carried a 105mm howitzer, a 40mm Bofors cannon, and a 25mm Gatling gun, all firing from the left side of the fuselage, while the pilot held a constant banking turn called a pylon turn. The aircraft's sensors could track a human body from 15,000 feet in total darkness. Its fire control computers could put a howitzer round through a window. But it moved at the speed of a regional turboprop and had the radar cross-section of a flying barn. So what made Iraqi soldiers, men who faced coalition armor, naval bombardment, B-52 strikes, single out this one platform as the thing that terrified them most? The answer starts with what the AC-130 did differently from everything else in the sky. Captain Ron Terry hauled the yoke of a modified C-47 over the Mekong Delta in 1964 and squeezed the trigger on 3 General Electric miniguns bolted to the cargo floor. The tracers poured out the left side in a solid red cone, chewing through tree canopy at 6,000 rounds per minute per gun. From the ground, the stream of fire looked like a tongue of light licking the earth. Viet Cong soldiers who survived these early attacks reported the sound reached them after the bullets did, a tearing noise like fabric ripping across the sky that arrived over a carpet of dead men. That aircraft carried the designation FC-47 and the nickname Puff the Magic Dragon. It proved a concept that no serious tactician had endorsed. A fixed-wing airplane flying circles over a target could deliver more sustained, accurate firepower than a strafing run ever could. A fighter on a gun pass had maybe 2 seconds of trigger time per approach. Terry's crew held the trigger for minutes. The concept worked because of geometry. In a pylon turn, a constant bank orbit around a fixed point, every gun on the left side of the aircraft pointed at the same spot on the ground simultaneously. The pilot didn't aim the guns, the pilot aimed the airplane. Fire control became a navigation problem, and navigation problems have solutions. But the C-47 had limits. The airframe couldn't carry enough armor, couldn't fly high enough to avoid small arms, and couldn't survive anything heavier than rifle fire. By 1967, the Air Force wanted the same firepower on a bigger, tougher airframe. They picked the C-130 Hercules. The first AC-130A Spectre arrived at Nha Trang Air Base in September 1968 with 4 miniguns, 4 20mm Vulcan cannons, and a rudimentary night observation device, basically a television camera strapped to a starlight scope. The heat inside the cargo bay during sustained fire turned the fuselage into an oven. Brass casings rolled across the deck like marbles in an earthquake. Gunners worked in a fog of cordite smoke so thick that some crews reported not being able to see the opposite wall of the aircraft. The target set that defined the Spectre's reputation sat 600 miles northwest of Saigon. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of roads, paths, river crossings, and supply depots threading through Laos and Cambodia, carried every bullet, every bag of rice, every replacement soldier, every liter of fuel that North Vietnam pushed south. Interdicting that network became an American obsession. Fast movers couldn't do it. They screamed over the canopy at 500 knots, dropped ordnance on coordinates, and flew home. The trucks kept moving. The AC-130 did something different. It loitered. A Spectre crew could arrive over a section of trail at sunset and stay until dawn. Its sensors picked up truck headlights, engine heat, even the thermal signature of a road surface that had been driven on recently. When a convoy appeared, sometimes 20-30 vehicles nose to tail on a dirt road through triple canopy jungle, the crew would start at the front of the column and work backward. The lead truck burned first, blocking the road. Then the tail vehicle. Everything between became a kill box. During Operation Commando Hunt, which ran from 1968 through 1972, AC-130 crews claimed over 10,000 trucks destroyed or damaged along the trail. The Air Force's own assessment used the word unprecedented to describe the destruction rate. 10,000 trucks. For context, North Vietnam's entire annual import capacity through Haiphong Harbor peaked at roughly 4.2 million tons. Every truck burning on a Laotian mountain road meant weapons that never reached the Mekong Delta, ammunition that never loaded into an AK magazine, food that never fed a regiment. The North Vietnamese adapted. They moved anti-aircraft guns south along the trail, 37mm, 57mm, eventually radar-guided systems. The price of loitering went up fast. Between 1969 and 1972, 6 AC-130s went down over Laos. 52 crewmen killed. The airplane kept flying and the crews kept volunteering. The trucks kept burning. The recoil shook the entire airframe. Every time the 105mm howitzer fired, the AC-130 lurched sideways like something had slapped it. Crew members standing near the breach felt the concussion in their teeth. The smell, burned propellant mixed with hydraulic fluid, and the metallic tang of superheated brass settled into flight suits and stayed for days. Laundry couldn't kill it. That howitzer had no business inside an airplane. The M102 is an artillery piece designed to sit on dirt, absorb recoil through a trail spade buried in the ground, and lob shells at targets miles away. The Air Force took this weapon, 4,600 pounds of steel built for static positions, and bolted it to the cargo ramp of a turboprop transport. The barrel protruded from a port-side gun port just aft of the left paratroop door. When the gun fired, the recoil force transferred directly into the airframe. Engineers reinforced the floor with titanium plating and redesigned the mount to redirect energy along the fuselage's longitudinal axis rather than punching it sideways through the skin. It shouldn't have worked. Every principle of aircraft weapons design favored low recoil, high rate of fire systems, rotary cannons, chain guns, things that spread force across many small impulses. A howitzer does the opposite. One massive impulse, one shell, and a single detonation at the target that could flatten a building. So, how did the crew aim it? The pilot flew the orbit. A standard pylon turn put the aircraft in a 30-degree bank at roughly 1.5 miles from the target, altitude anywhere from 7,000 to 15,000 feet depending on the threat environment. The fire control officer fed target coordinates into a ballistic computer that calculated wind, airspeed, bank angle, altitude, and the shell's trajectory. The computer generated a steering cue on the pilot's heads-up display, a small circle the pilot kept centered by adjusting the turn. When the circle aligned, the sensor operator confirmed the target on infrared, and the gunner pulled the lanyard. The shell left the barrel at 1,600 feet per second. Time of flight from 12,000 feet to ground level ran about 6 seconds. The round carried enough high explosive to destroy a T-72 tank. 6 seconds. A man on the ground heard nothing until the round hit. No jet roar, no dive scream. Just the low drone of turboprops somewhere above the overcast. Then the earth opened up. The infrared sensor ball hung beneath the forward fuselage like a glass eye the size of a basketball. Inside it, a cryogenically cooled detector array measured temperature differences of less than half a degree Fahrenheit at ranges exceeding 8 miles. A human body standing in an open field at midnight registered as a bright white smear against cool black terrain. A vehicle that had been parked for an hour still glowed from residual engine heat. Tire tracks on wet sand held thermal signatures for 20 minutes after the truck passed. This sensor, the All-Light Level Television and Infrared Detection System, ALLTV for short, gave the AC-130 something no other weapons platform in the 1990s possessed at comparable fidelity. Persistent target discrimination in total darkness, not a snapshot or a radar return that showed a blob and left the operator guessing. A continuous, real-time thermal picture sharp enough to distinguish a man carrying a rifle from a man carrying a shovel. The sensor operator sat at a console inside the aircraft, watching the ground scroll beneath the orbit on a 12-inch monitor, adjusting contrast and zoom with a hand controller while calling out targets to the fire control officer, seated 3 feet to his left. The kill chain ran like this. The sensor operator found a target. The fire control officer designated it in the ballistic computer. The computer calculated a firing solution and pushed steering cues to the pilot. The pilot adjusted the orbit. The navigator confirmed position against GPS and terrain references. The electronic warfare officer monitored threat receivers for radar-guided anti-aircraft systems and called out any change in the electromagnetic environment. Then, and only then, the aircraft commander authorized weapons release. 7 people touched every trigger pull. 7 separate judgments between detection and detonation. The Air Force built redundancy into the process deliberately, because the consequences of hitting the wrong target from an airplane that could loiter for hours over a populated area went beyond tactical failure. One bad round on a civilian structure, and the strategic utility of the platform evaporated overnight. What did the crew choose to shoot? That depended on the target. The GAU-12, Equalizer, a 5-barrel 25mm Gatling gun spinning at 1,800 rounds per minute, handled soft targets. Troops in the open, unarmored vehicles, supply points, antenna farms. The rounds arrived in a dense cone that covered an area roughly the size of a tennis court per 2-second burst. Against dismounted infantry with no overhead cover, the effect resembled industrial shredding. The 40mm Bofors cannon sat between the Gatling gun and the howitzer in both position and punch. It fired slower, about 100 rounds per minute, but each shell carried enough explosive to penetrate light armor. Armored personnel carriers, bunkers with timber and earth roofs. The Bofors cracked them open, and the 105 delivered the knockout. Hardened structures, tanks, command posts, reinforced fighting positions. 1 round, 6 seconds of flight, then a detonation that threw debris 200 feet from the impact point. 3 weapons covering every target class from a single airframe that never left its orbit. The crew shifted between them in seconds, sometimes firing the Gatling on one target and the howitzer on another within the same orbit. A declassified after-action report from Operation Desert Storm describes one AC-130H crew engaging 14 separate targets in a single 45-minute period over the Kuwaiti coastline, switching between all 3 weapon systems without breaking the pylon turn. The report's language is clinical, almost bored. All targets neutralized. No friendly casualties. Aircraft returned to base with residual ammunition. Residual ammunition! They ran out of things to kill before they ran out of bullets. The Iraqis fought at night because they believed darkness protected them. Coalition air superiority during daylight hours pushed every resupply convoy, every troop movement, every command vehicle into the hours between sunset and sunrise. It made sense as doctrine. It had worked against Iran for 8 years, but Iran didn't have an airplane that turned darkness into a lit stage and watched from the balcony with a howitzer. We could not see it. We could only hear it, and then men were dying. That line comes from an Iraqi battalion commander's field report recovered by coalition intelligence teams after the recapture of Khafji in early February 1991. The document, handwritten, smudged, with what analysts believe to be diesel fuel, described the night of January 29th in language that read more like a casualty notification than a tactical summary. Sources conflict on whether the officer survived the week. The Iraqi plan for Khafji looked reasonable on paper. 3 mechanized columns from the 5th Mechanized Division would push south across the Saudi border, under cover of darkness, seize the coastal town, and hand Saddam Hussein the one thing he needed most: a propaganda victory showing Arab soldiers driving into Saudi Arabia while the coalition dithered. The columns moved at sunset. T-55 tanks, BMP armored personnel carriers, fuel trucks, command vehicles, roughly 2,000 men rolling south through flat, open desert with no terrain features taller than a man's waist. They drove straight into the thermal sensors of 2 AC-130 Spectre gunships orbiting at 12,000 feet. The first column never reached the border. Sensor operators picked up the vehicles at 11 miles, a procession of white-hot signatures crawling across black sand like luminous insects on a dark tabletop. The lead Spectre began with the 105, dropping rounds onto the first and last vehicles in the column to create the same trap that had worked on the Ho Chi Minh Trail 20 years earlier. Front vehicle burning, rear vehicle burning, everything between stopped. Then the Bofors walked through the middle of the formation, while the second gunship worked the flanks with the GAU-12. Iraqi soldiers dismounted into the desert and ran. The infrared showed them clearly, bright figures sprinting away from bright vehicles, scattering in every direction across sand that offered nothing to hide behind. The crews tracked them but held fire on dismounted personnel fleeing the engagement area. The vehicles burned. The second column hit the same wall 40 minutes later, 8 miles to the east. This crew ran through ammunition faster, the convoy bunched tighter, and the Bofors chewed through its magazine on a cluster of BMPs packed nose to tail at a road junction that no longer existed by dawn. What reached Khafji amounted to a fraction of the original force. Enough to occupy the town briefly, not enough to hold it. A captured Iraqi lieutenant from the 3rd Armored Division, taken prisoner during the coalition counterattack on January 31st, told his debriefers that his unit received no warning about the gunships, no briefing on their capabilities, no guidance on countermeasures. His company commander told the men they would be safe moving at night because American pilots could not see in the dark. The lieutenant's debriefing transcript, declassified in 1995, includes a single sentence that carries more weight than any after-action analysis. He was wrong about everything. The Khafji engagements destroyed or disabled over 60 Iraqi vehicles in a single night. 2 aircraft, 2 crews of 14 men each. 28 Americans in 2 slow turboprops dismantled an armored offensive that had taken weeks to plan and stage. The desert south of the border smelled like burning rubber and cooked metal for days afterward. A greasy, sweet stench that hung in the still winter air and drifted south into the coalition lines. Iraqi radio intercepts from the following week showed a sharp drop in nighttime vehicle movement across the entire Kuwaiti theater. Units that had moved freely after dark now sat still until morning, which put them under the fast movers and the A-10s. Nowhere to hide. No hour of the clock that belonged to them anymore. 47. That's the number of captured Iraqi military diaries and personal journals cataloged by the Foreign Military Studies Office at Fort Leavenworth between 1991 and 1994. Most cover routine garrison complaints, bad food, missing mail, officers skimming pay. 11 mention aircraft by type. Every single one of those 11 mentions the AC-130. A conscript sergeant from the 48th Infantry Division kept a pocket notebook with entries running from mid-January through his capture on February 24th. His handwriting deteriorated across the pages, steady block script at the start, then increasingly erratic, words slanting downhill, ink smeared. The entry for February 2nd reads in part, "It comes after midnight, always after midnight. The sound is not like a jet, it stays. You hear the engines for so long you forget what silence is, and then something next to you explodes, and you remember. The staying." That detail surfaces in diary after diary, interrogation after interrogation. Fast jets terrified men for seconds. The AC-130 terrified them for hours. A Republican Guard captain, name redacted in the declassified transcript, told his interrogators at a processing facility in Hafar al-Batin that his company stopped responding to radio calls during gunship orbits. Not because the radios broke, because the men refused to transmit, convinced the aircraft tracked radio emissions. The file notes this belief had no technical basis. It didn't matter. The captain couldn't get his platoon leaders to pick up the handset after dark. So, what does helplessness look like in a military unit? Soldiers stop digging fighting positions because they believe no hole is deep enough. A lieutenant reports that 3 of his men walked north toward Basra in the middle of the night. No weapons, no orders, nobody told. And in a water-stained diary, a single line, "God has forgotten this place." The FMSO analysts who compiled these documents noted a pattern they called acoustic fixation, a psychological state where the persistent drone of the turboprops dominated all cognitive function. Men stopped eating, stopped checking perimeters. They just listened, waiting to learn whether the next explosion would land on them or 50 meters away. One diary describes a soldier pressing his ear to the sand, trying to feel vibrations that might tell him where the shells would fall. The analyst's marginal note on that passage uses the word heartbreaking, their word. These men fought Iran for 8 years in trenches that would have looked familiar to soldiers at Verdun. They endured chemical attacks, human wave assaults, artillery bombardments, lasting days. They knew how to suffer. What they couldn't process, what broke something fundamental in unit after unit, was an enemy they could hear but never see, never shoot back at, never outlast or outwait. 6:14 a.m., January 31st, 1991. First light crept across the Persian Gulf coast in a pale gray band that erased the darkness the AC-130 needed to survive. Spirit 03 and IC-130H. Spectre out of the 16th Special Operations Squadron had been orbiting over Khafji since before midnight. The crew of 14 knew the timeline. They knew dawn meant exposure. Mission planning called for all gunships to egress the target area no later than 30 minutes before nautical twilight, when the sky brightened enough to silhouette a 4-engine turboprop against the horizon. The mission commander aboard Spirit 03, Major Paul Weaver, requested permission to remain on station. Marines on the ground still needed fire support. The counterattack to retake Khafji had stalled in places, and Iraqi mechanized units kept probing the Saudi lines south of town. Weaver's crew stayed. They stayed 17 minutes too long. The SA-7 Grail is a Soviet-designed, shoulder-fired infrared missile that weighs about 15 pounds and fits in a tube short enough for one man to carry at a jog. It locks onto heat sources, engine exhaust, primarily, and tracks them with a seeker head roughly as sophisticated as a 1970s pocket calculator. Against fast movers pulling 6 Gs at 400 knots, the SA-7 struggled. Against a 150,000-pound airplane flying a predictable left-hand orbit at 180 knots, it did not struggle at all. Sources conflict on whether the missile that hit Spirit 03 came from an SA-7 or the newer SA-16 Gimlet. The wreckage didn't clarify the question. The result looked the same. The missile struck the No. 3 engine nacelle on the port wing. Fuel lines ruptured. Fire spread inboard faster than the crew could execute emergency procedures. Weaver turned the aircraft toward the coast, toward the water, toward any chance of a controlled ditching, but the wing structure failed within seconds. Spirit 03 rolled inverted and hit the shallow water just offshore at approximately 6:18 a.m. All 14 crew members died. The rescue teams found debris spread across 300 meters of tidal flat. Personal effects mixed with aircraft fragments in the gray mud. A flight glove, a shattered sensor console panel, a boot. The bodies took 2 days to recover because the crash site sat within range of Iraqi small arms positions that hadn't been cleared yet. Marines from Task Force Taro provided security while the recovery teams worked. 14 men. The largest single-incident loss for Air Force Special Operations. Command in Desert Storm. Major Weaver, Captain Arthur Galvan, Captain William Grimm, Captain Dixon Walters, Technical Sergeant John Olschlager. The full crew list fills a memorial plaque at Hurlburt Field that most visitors walk past without reading. Spirit 03's loss is so specifically maddening because the vulnerability that killed them appeared in every operational assessment the Air Force ever produced on the AC-130. Slow, predictable orbit, lethal below 10,000 feet to any infrared missile system manufactured after 1965. The aircraft's survivability depended entirely on darkness and on commanders who enforced the dawn egress window without exception. Weaver asked to stay because Marines needed him. The Marines needed him because the counterattack timeline slipped. The timeline slipped because the ground plan assumed faster progress through the town. One delay fed another, and the last link in the chain burned over the Gulf. The crew of Spirit 03 died doing exactly what the AC-130 did better than anything else in the inventory. Lingering over a battlefield, killing what needed killing, protecting the men below. The airframe's greatest tactical advantage and its greatest vulnerability shared the same route. The same slow, patient orbit. The Air Force does not lose well. It loses once, then rewrites the manual. Rockwell's engineers at the Palmdale plant had the AC-130U Spooky 2 on the production floor before Spirit. 03's memorial service ended. That timeline isn't quite right. The program predated the shootdown by several years, but the loss at Kofji ripped open every funding debate, every schedule delay, every procurement officer who'd argued the legacy H model still had life in it. The AN/ALQ-172 infrared countermeasures suite that went into the U model could spoof an SA-7 seeker head at ranges the older chaff and flare system couldn't touch. Radar warning receivers covered bands the H model had ignored entirely. A pressurized cabin let the crew operate above 15,000 feet, out of the SA-7's engagement envelope altogether. Look at the numbers. The H model carried a fire control computer that filled 2 equipment racks and processed targeting solutions slower than a crew member with a stopwatch and a grease pencil could estimate windage. The U model's AN/APQ-180 strike radar painted targets through weather and smoke, through the oil fire haze that choked Kuwait for months. Synthetic aperture mode gave sensor operators a ground picture so sharp they could distinguish a T-72 from a BMP at 9 miles. The 105 stayed. The Bofors went away, replaced by a single L-60 Bofors with an automated feed system that cut the gun crew from 5 men to 2. The first operational U model deployed in 1995. 4 years from blood to better aircraft. But hardware only solves half the problem. Spirit 03 didn't die because the H model lacked countermeasures. It died because the mission commander chose to stay past the survivability window. So, the 16th Special Operations Squadron rewrote its standing operating procedures with language that reads less like doctrine and more like a headstone inscription. No mission requirement justifies exceeding the time on station window established during mission planning. The phrase mission requirement appears in bold. A former squadron commander told an interviewer in 2004 that the rule carried an unofficial name among the crews. They called it the Weaver Line. Cross it, and you answer to 14 ghosts. We fly at night because we die in daylight. That sentence opens the AC-130 Tactics Manual revision dated March 1992. Blunt enough to sting. Blunt enough to save crews who might otherwise talk themselves into one more orbit, one more pass over troops who needed fire support desperately. The Iraqi conscript pressing his ear to the sand, listening for vibrations. Paul Weaver banking toward the coast with his port wing on fire. The same war produced both moments. One man trying to survive the AC-130, another man dying inside one. The aircraft that created helplessness in its enemies demanded the same acceptance from its crews. The orbit has limits. The darkness has an edge. The clock does not negotiate. Spirit 03's crew flew an aircraft that couldn't protect them. The crews who followed flew one that could, because 14 men proved, at the cost America always pays for its lessons, exactly what needed fixing. 2:17 a.m., local time, somewhere over Helmand Province, 2018. An AC-130J Ghost Rider banked into a left-hand orbit at 22,000 feet. Pressurized, climate-controlled, the crew drinking coffee while a 30mm chain gun and a 105mm howitzer waited for coordinates from a joint terminal attack controller on the valley floor. The turboprops hummed. The sensor ball watched. 54 years after Ron Terry's miniguns chewed through Mekong canopy, the concept hadn't changed. The airplane flew in circles and killed what it could see. The Soviets never built one. The British and French talked about it, studied it, ran feasibility assessments. No other nation on Earth fielded an operational gunship program past the prototype stage. Why? Not because the airframe posed some impossible engineering challenge. The C-130 Hercules airframe sold to 69 countries. Lockheed built over 2,700 of them. Half the world's air forces owned the base platform. The guns presented no mystery either. A 105mm howitzer is 1940s technology. Bolting weapons to a cargo floor required welding skill, not genius. The sensor suite demanded sophistication, sure, but dozens of nations operated comparable infrared and radar systems on other platforms by the 1990s. Every individual component existed in global inventories. The hard part sat between the components. Integration. Training crews who could operate 5 weapon systems, 3 sensor modes, and a fire control computer while flying a pylon turn at 180 knots in contested airspace at night. Maintaining a fleet of aircraft so heavily modified that no two shared identical wiring harnesses. The maintenance officers at Hurlburt Field called the H models snowflakes, because each one required its own technical manual supplements. Building an institutional culture where a mission commander, a fire control officer, a navigator, a sensor operator, 2 pilots, and 8 enlisted specialists fused into a single organism that could prosecute 37 targets in one orbit without fratricide. The AC-130 didn't require a rich country. It required a country that had spent 40 years perfecting combined arms integration from the air, that maintained a special operations infrastructure deep enough to absorb losses and keep flying the next night, that possessed, and this mattered more than the money, the doctrinal arrogance to look at a cargo plane and see a warship. The conscript sergeant from the 48th Infantry Division, the one whose handwriting fell apart across 6 weeks of notebook entries, surrendered to the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment on February 24th. His interrogation transcript runs 4 pages. He told the debriefer he believed the aircraft circling his position carried a crew of at least 40 men, because no smaller number could operate so many weapons simultaneously. The actual crew numbered 14. He overestimated by nearly 3 times, and the error makes a certain kind of sense. The volume of fire suggested a platoon, not a squad. The FMSO file on that sergeant ends with his transfer to a holding facility near Rafah. After repatriation, the trail goes cold. Iraqi military records from the post-war period remain largely inaccessible. His name appears once more in a 1993 Red Cross document confirming his return to Basra province. Then nothing. Paul Weaver's name appears on the memorial wall at Hurlburt Field, 3rd row from the top, between a crew member lost in Panama and one lost in training over Florida. The wall sits in a courtyard between the squadron headquarters and the flight line. Crews pass it on the way to their aircraft. At night, when the 16th Special Operations Squadron launches sorties, the parking ramp lights catch the etched letters at an angle. Hurlburt Field still smells like jet fuel and turboprop exhaust. The AC-130J. Ghost Rider flies out of there now. Same runway, same unit lineage, same left-hand orbit. The 105 is gone from the J model. replaced by precision-guided munitions and a Griffin missile system. The crew compartment carries fewer men. The sensors see farther. Ron Terry retired as a colonel and settled in the Florida Panhandle, 20 minutes from the base where the whole thing started. He died in 2014 at 81. His obituary ran 6 lines in the local paper.